Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Jewish Studies Center class on American klezmer music. I'm sure you'll very much enjoy today's class. My name is Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the Jewish Studies Center treasurer. And as treasurer, I want to tell you that our classes are free, and Seth and all of our wonderful teachers are very knowledgeable and talented. However, we do have many expenses. For example, we have to pay for the Zoom services, we have to maintain our website, and we have other expenses. So donations are very much appreciated. You can donate on our website under the heading Donate. You can contribute with a credit card, PayPal, or by sending us a check. Just go to Donate and fill out the form. If you have questions or comments, which we welcome, please put them in the chat box and write them to everyone. After Seth has finished, our Vice President, Mindy Reiser, will consolidate the questions and ask them to Seth. Now it's my pleasure to say a few words about tonight's class. Seth Keibel is a very talented, knowledgeable, and energetic musician and teacher. In January, he taught a 2-session class for us on some of the great Jewish jazz musicians. He was remarkable in his descriptions of the personal histories and the musical features of these great jazz musicians, such as Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and some others. But his wonderful playing of their signature music were the real highlights of the class. Seth has been performing in the greater Washington area for a number of years, and he has won many, many awards for his music and also for his teaching. You can read more about his background and his awards in the page on this class in our website, www.jewishstudycenter.org, and also on Seth's website, www.sethkeibel.com. And it's SETHKIBEL. Enough of me talking about it. I know you enjoy his class. Take it away, Seth.
All right. Thank you so much, Jerry. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday evening for the first of my 2-part installment on klezmer music. A couple of quick housekeeping remarks. First of all, Jerry did an excellent job, but for those of you who need a little helpful reminder on how to correctly pronounce the syllables in my last name, you just repeat the following lyric to yourself. Repeat after me, on mute, of course. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to hear from Seth Keibel, it ain't necessarily so. Look, as Jerry said, everyone is going to need to remain muted. And I know that Mindy and Victoria and Bracha and everyone are going to be merciless in keeping you muted throughout this presentation. They'll say it pains them to do so, but it really gives them a lot of joy. Look, it's just a necessity. With this many people, even if people agreed to be completely quiet, just the reverberations from everyone's device would create just an ungodly sonic swirl. So I strongly encourage you to avail yourself of Zoom's chat feature. I know at this point everyone is a Zoom ninja, but I recommend you go and hit that chat button now, so that chat window is off to the side of your screen. And at any point during my presentation, any questions, comments, connections, go ahead, type them in, and Mindy will sort through them all and forward anything even remotely pertinent to me in the last 10-15 minutes of class. Okay, those of you who have taken classes with me before know I always like to get things started with a little bit of live music, just to get you guys all in the mood and get my juices flowing as well. So I'm going to pick up my clarinet here. And I'm going to play an old klezmer tune. Let's see, what should I play? Well, here's an old, one of these ones, klezmer melodies that goes back hundreds of years. Who knows who first wrote it? That great Jewish composer Anonymous, or Anonymous Steen. Anyway, this is entitled A Nacht in Gan Eden. which translated from the Yiddish into English means a night in the Garden of Eden, which is pretty apropos because my understanding from the great Talmudic rabbis of yore is they have determined that the Garden of Eden wasn't an actual literal location, but was actually a Zoom meeting. Okay. Oh, thank you. I do so thrive off your virtual applause. Thank you so much. So look, any discussion about klezmer music must inevitably start with the thorny question of definition. What is klezmer? And that, as you will see, is a confusing and complicated question. If we had a room full of 30 klezmer musicians and asked them to define klezmer, you'd probably get about 40 different answers, a couple of arguments, and maybe a fist fight or two. So let's spend some time exploring this issue. The first thing I want to look at, of course, and this I got to check myself, etymology is words, entomology is bugs, I think. Yes. So I see Victoria nodding her head. So we will go with the etymology of the word. Now, klezmer, as we will see, is a Yiddish word, but its etymology, its origins come from two Hebrew words, of course, written here in transliteration. Klei and Zemer. Now, as you probably know, Hebrew is a pretty small language. Every word in Hebrew has like 6 or 7 different meanings. So what do these words mean? Well, clay has a lot of different meanings. Instrument, tool, vessel, a medium, a device for accomplishing a task. That's clay. And Zemer, much more simply, is song or music. Clay, Zemer, instrument, tool, vessel, song, or music. put those two Hebrew words together, Klezmer, Klezmer. You get the Yiddish word klezmer. And indeed, the original meaning of the word klezmer in Yiddish referred not to a genre of music, not a style of music like we talk about jazz or rock or blues or what have you. No, klezmer referred to the musicians themselves. The itinerant musician of Eastern European shtetl, village life, was a klezmer, regardless of what music they played. I mean, whether they played the music we today call klezmer music or other repertoires, which we'll talk about down the line. It was not the music itself, it was the musician. And it's really only in the modern klezmer revival, meaning the modern resurgence of interest in this music from about the mid-1970s up until the present day, that people have taken this old Yiddish word that used to refer to the musicians themselves and now use it as a genre descriptive to describe a body of work, a style of music, klezmer music. So therein lies part of the reason for the confusion over the definition for klezmer. Its use to describe a genre of music is actually a relative recent phenomenon. Now, of course, one of the beauties of Yiddish is that not every word is readily translatable into English. And indeed, klezmer falls into that category because actually the word had just a little bit of a negative derogatory connotation. A klezmer was not a serious, respectable musician. I mean, let me put it this way. You might be okay if your daughter decided to marry a musician in the old country, someone who played in one of the Tsar's military bands, or someone who attended one of the conservatories that admitted Jews, like the ones in Odessa or Kiev. But you wouldn't want your daughter to marry a klezmer. A klezmer was someone who couldn't be provided counted on to provide for a family, who was irresponsible. I mean, people ascribe to these klezmers, or klezmorim, as the Yiddish plural would have it, some of the same negative stereotypes that people have about us musicians to this very day, which of course that are completely untrue, that we're unreliable, irresponsible, argumentative, gamble, drink too much. Complete fiction. Anyway, klezmer had a little bit of that derogatory connotation. Now, of course, quick qualification. I'm not trying to be overtly sexist when I say you wouldn't want your daughter to marry a klezmer. Because, of course, as we'll talk about, in the old country, this was a strictly male domain, like almost everything else in Eastern European Jews. In New York, in the 20th century, those lines start to blur, and certainly those lines have blurred a lot today. We'll talk about that more later on. Okay, so I still haven't defined klezmer. I've just merely told you the etymology and some of the reasons for the confusion over the definition for klezmer. So let me actually define it now. But here too, it gets thorny, where you kind of have almost a dichotomy, whereby the academians, the ethnomusicologists who study this music, have developed a very specific and precise definition for what klezmer music is. And I'll give you that academic, narrow definition in a minute. And this definition is based largely on the circumstances in which this music was played in the old country, over in Eastern Europe, basically before the modern era, pre-20th century. This definition is not based on how this music was played in more recent decades, how it was played in New York in the early decades of the 20th century, and it's certainly not based on how this music is played today. So let's start with that narrow academic definition, and then we'll expand outward from there. All right, I'm going to give it to you now, and then I'm going to go through and explain this, how they derive this definition, clause by clause. Here it is. Secular, instrumental, Eastern European Jewish folk music. Again, for those in the back, secular, instrumental, Eastern European Jewish folk music. All right, let me go through this clause by clause. Secular, not religious. Now, In the old country, these musicians did not play for religious functions or religious circumstances or religious traditions, what have you. They didn't, for a lot of understandable reasons. First of all, we know from many written and oral, AURAL accounts, that the rabbinical authorities in the old country didn't often look too kindly on these musicians, perhaps because of some of those perceived lifestyle issues I mentioned. More importantly than that, remember that before the modern conservative and reform movements, instrumental music made with instruments, is barred from religious service. I'm not an expert at it, but I believe the rabbis of yore had written that until the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem, you couldn't have instruments in the worship of the Lord, only the human voice. That's true in most Orthodox congregations to this day. So it was not a religious music. Now, someone may be furiously typing into the chat right now and going, wait a minute, Seth Kibble, didn't these musicians play for weddings? Isn't that a religious context? Well, yes, it's true. One of the primary arenas for this music in every era of its history is the Jewish wedding. But in the old country, these musicians did not play for any of the religious components of the wedding. They played only for the secular aspects. You know, today, when I'm hired to play a wedding, oftentimes I won't just play the reception, I'll play the ceremony. I will play for the religious components. That didn't happen back then. This music was strictly secular. Okay, secular instrumental. That means with instruments, not with the voice. Indeed, in the old country, before the modern era, these klezmer musicians, did not sing and they did not work with vocalists. Now, there is, as you probably well know, a rich tradition in the old country of both Yiddish folk song and Yiddish theater. But in the old country, in Eastern Europe, those are separate traditions, separate disciplines operating completely independent of each other. These klezmer musicians in the old country did not sing, did not work with vocalists. Again, in New York, those lines will start to get kind of blurry. We'll get there. Okay, secular instrumental. Eastern European is pretty self-explanatory. The area commonly known as the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were permitted to reside. I've been told by several people that I should amend this to say Central and Eastern European, because apparently a lot of the folks in the former Soviet republics don't like the term Eastern Europe, because it, conjures up images of the Warsaw Pact era, etc. So that's fine. Great. Central and Eastern European. Jewish is pretty self-explanatory. Folk music. Music that is handed down generation to generation as a folk tradition, and music, and this is very important, that serves a purpose, that is utilitarian. Throughout most of its history, klezmer is music that is made only for a purpose, for dancing, or background, or some kind of custom, but it is not music that is ever being made or listened to for its own intrinsic artistic value. It is not pure music. The idea of a klezmer concert, something I do fairly often. Hey, I'm doing one in Sunday, Burtonsville, Maryland. I'll tell you about it later. Where people come and sit politely and give me their undivided attention and clap, hopefully, after each song. That never happened. The klezmer concert is an anachronism of the modern klezmer revival. This music was strictly utilitarian in purpose. So, that narrow definition is, again, secular, instrumental, Eastern European, Jewish folk music. But today, in the United States, in the year 2021, you'd be hard to find a single klezmer band that limits themselves to secular, instrumental, Eastern European, Jewish folk music. Klezmer bands today cast a much wider net for their repertoire. Indeed, klezmer bands today frequently perform Yiddish folk songs, like Rosenkiss mit Mandeln, Raisins and Almonds, Oiflin Pripitchik, what have you. Israeli dance songs. I won't even get into that. Yiddish theater songs like, Romania, Romania, and by Mirbis Duchesne. My goodness, I don't think there's a klezmer band in the world that doesn't play by Mirbis Duchesne. It's required by law. Now, those repertoires don't meet that narrow definition of klezmer. The academics would tell you, no, that is not klezmer. But klezmer bands today actively perform and concertize and record and play that repertoire at simchas, what have you. As a result, many people now include it under the larger klezmer umbrella. And the modern kind of practical definition of klezmer is based largely on what klezmer bands today perform, which is a much wider repertoire than just secular, instrumental, Eastern European Jewish folk music. In fact, klezmer has almost become a catch-all term for almost the entirety of the Ashkenazi, that is Eastern European, Jewish musical tradition. Now, Sephardic music is a whole nother entirely wonderful ball of wax that I will not get into tonight, nor am I really qualified to do so. It's kind of like if a klezmer band plays it, it must be klezmer. Now, a lot of klezmer bands play YMCA. I'm not trying to argue that that's klezmer, but I think you get my drift. Look, every genre of music has these issues of classification. Look, take classical music, for instance. If you go up to one of my esteemed friends on the faculty of Peabody here in Baltimore and say, define classical music for me, he or she will say something to the effect of, classical music is Western European art music written roughly between the years, 1750 and 1820. It's like, the time of Mozart and Haydn to early Beethoven. That's classical music. If you play that professor some Bach, they're going to say, that's not classical music. That's Baroque. If you play them some Brahms or Schubert, they're going to say, that's not classical music. That's romantic. But if you go up to your average person on the street and play some, Bach or Brahms and Schubert, they're going to say, if they say anything at all, that's classical music. You go into your local record store, if you even have such a thing anymore, and go to the pimply-faced kid behind the counter and say, excuse me, sir, where is your Baroque section? You're going to get a funny look. It's all classical music for practical classification. That's kind of what's happened with klezmer. All right, let's move on. I want to do something a little different now. I want to share with you an experience that I think is pretty much as close as we can possibly get to an actual time machine. And that is this. I want to play for you some of the earliest wax cylinder recordings of this music played in Eastern Europe at the dawn of the 20th century, well over a century ago. Now, I got to say a few words about these before I play them for you and explain why I think this is like a time machine. First of all, the technology itself. Wax cylinder was literally that. It was the type of recording technology first developed by Thomas Edison, or at least someone who worked for Thomas Edison, and it allowed you to record a few minutes of music onto an actual cylinder, not a disc, a cylinder of wax. Now, at the dawn of the 20th century, no one was mass producing wax cylinder recordings and selling them at the local 5 and dime store. No, in the first years of the 20th century, the only people who were using this wax cylinder technology basically fall into two categories. Technologists like Edison, who are trying to, develop this new technology, and a few far-sighted musicologists, ethnomusicologists, who saw in this new technology a unique window of opportunity to record traditional ethnic folk music before it was tainted, if you will, by modern influences. Probably the most famous example of this is Bela Bartok, who famously went into the Hungarian countryside and made hundreds of recordings of traditional Hungarian folk music, not Jewish. And Bela Bartok talked very explicitly about how he felt he was in a race against time with this new technology to get into these little villages and record some of this folk music before the urban modern influences encroached and you could no longer distinguish the traditional from what was new. Now, when you put this together, you come to a remarkable conclusion about the recordings I'm about to play for you, which is this: the musicians you're about to hear probably had very little, if any, idea what was going on. This is the voyeuristic aspect of this. They're in their city, their village, whatever. Some stranger comes in with some bizarre contraption with a big bell horn on it and says, play into there. The idea that what they were playing in that moment over 100 years ago could be listened to in a Zoom meeting of all places in the United States was literally beyond their comprehension. This is different than someone making a recording in a recording studio when they're conscious of the fact that it's going to potentially last. These musicians you're about to hear probably had no idea what was going on. And if you were to go back in time and tell them someone would be listening, 152 Jews would be listening to their music on an electronic device over 100 years later, it would have literally blown their minds. I get goose pimples when I listen to these recordings and I think about that. Okay, the first recording I'm going to play for you is made in Bucharest, Romania, 1908, by a group with the wonderful name of Belf's Romanian Orchestra. And the tune here is entitled Ma Iofis, which roughly translates as How Beautiful. Of course, you know, one of the things about Klezmer as a folk tradition is there's a lot of inconsistency in the nomenclature, meaning the same melody can have a lot of different titles. The same title can apply to a lot of different melodies. For example, one of the most popular titles in Klezmer is Nacha Glezel Wein, another glass of wine. I have no idea why that title is so popular. I know of about 6 different melodies with that title. Now, in this case, this tune, Ma Iofis, is actually a fairly popular Klezmer tune. You may have heard it in passing. It's most often today titled Tanz, Tanz, Yiddle, or Dance, Dance, Little Jews. But I've heard it by other titles as well. Here it's called Ma Iofis. Anyway, let me play this for you. Now, before anyone asks, I did once teach this course, and someone actually commented, wow, do you have a wax cylinder machine there? No, of course not. These have all been transcribed and digitized and put on CDs and digital recordings. I don't have a big wax cylinder machine here with a USB drive that I plug into my computer. Okay, had to get that out of the way. Let me get this going. This is obviously audio only. All right. Let me play you another one of those wax cylinder recordings from over 100 years ago. Let me set this one up. This particular recording that I'm going to play for you, hold on, sorry. Here we go. Is also from 1908, recorded in Warsaw, Poland. And it's a fiddler, a violinist. By the way, violin and fiddle, same thing. It's just how you play it or how well you were raised. That depends on what you call it. It's a fiddler named Josef Selinsky, accompanied by piano. We don't know who the piano is. And the song has a very strange title. It's listed as Orientalische Motive 2. Now, what kind of fakaksatai is that? What does that mean? Well, let me explain. I think I know what probably happened here. Now, it's hard for our modern minds to comprehend, and I include all of us in that. But musicians before the modern era didn't always feel the need to name everything. Now that seems almost incomprehensible to us. I mean, today when you write a piece of music, the most important part of the composition process is putting that title at the top of the page. I mean, we have to name and classify everything. If we didn't, we'd never be able to handle all the information we have. We still can't handle it, but that's another story. Well, that wasn't always true. Musicians did not always feel the need to name things. They played the same songs with their same family members year after year. They didn't have names for stuff. Look, in the world of classical music, all the great classical composers, they didn't name anything. Mozart just wrote, piano concertos and symphonies. We've numbered them based on the order in which we think he wrote them. He didn't number them. And, some of them have nicknames. He just wrote a sonata. Beethoven wrote a sonata. Bach wrote another cantata. We refer to it by the first line in the cantata, but he just wrote another cantata. So these musicians didn't always name everything. And back at this time period, when these musicologists were recording stuff, they had a tendency to give some of these songs that they recorded very kind of scientific names, almost Darwinian type names. So what probably happened here is that Josef Selinsky played this song, and the guy who recorded it said, "What do you call that?" And Josef Selinsky said something to the effect of, "I don't know." So the guy gave it a very scientific sort of title. Now, I guess to his ears in 1908, this sounded Oriental to him. It doesn't really, but in 1908, that's what it sounded like to him. So it became Orientalische, Oriental-like, motive, theme. But he must have already recorded an Orientalische motive. So this became Orientalische Motive 2. It's kind of funny when you start looking at both early recordings and early transcriptions of this music in the old country, you find a lot of strange titles like this. Titles that are almost, like I said, almost scientific, genus and species. Anyway, let me play this for you before we move on. Another one of these miraculous wax cylinder recordings. Again, listening to these, I get goose pimples. I feel like I'm looking through a window in time back to 1908. All right. I want to talk about a few other aspects of klezmer in the old country before we depart for the new world. First of all, as I mentioned briefly, but I don't want to elaborate on it, music, like most other professions in Eastern European Jewish life, was indeed a family affair. And you know, these, when you were born into a family band, you know, that was your gig. In fact, let me throw a word out at you: Capella. Capella is the Yiddish word for a group of klezmer musicians. What today you would call a klezmer band, they called a capella. I think there's usually an E in there. I typed it wrong. Capella. Same Germanic roots as, you know, a cappella, Kapellmeister, all that stuff. So this family structure of the bands had some really interesting consequences for the music. First of all, the size and instrumentation of these capellas in the old country were generally not determined by musical, practical, or financial considerations. No, the size of these capellas were generally determined by women's fertility. The more male children born into one of these musical families, the larger the family capella. And as each male child came of age, they received whatever instrument was already in the family or could be easily obtained. Furthermore, because of the family structure of these bands, there was very little competition among Jewish musicians in the old country. Let me elaborate, because this will become important when we switch over to New York. First of all, there was very little competition between bands. You know, if you were in one of these shtetls, one of these smaller shtetls, there might only be one capella nearby, maybe two, who knows? So, I mean, if you wanted music, you either hired the band in town or you didn't. There were no other options. You couldn't have your cousin Moishe with an iPad, spin tune, or a DJ or something like that. And more importantly, there's virtually no competition between musicians. Because when you were born into one of these family capellas, you had a gig for life. You weren't going to leave your family band to join some other family band. You weren't going to be fired from your own family. Okay, I'm sure there were isolated examples of that happening, but that would have to be pretty extreme. As a result, you come to the astonishing conclusion that in the old country, there is very little correlation between musical ability and income. And really, the only incentive for musical improvement, self-improvement, is self-satisfaction. But if you get better at your instrument, if you become a virtuoso, it's not necessarily going to mean you make more money. You know, you could be a complete virtuoso and you'll make just as much as your talentless cousin Moishe in the same capella. Now, I am not trying to say that these musicians in the old country were all slouches. That's not true. But they were definitely a mixed bag. You could be a talentless musician born into one of these family bands and still work and still have a gig for life. It's extremely non-competitive, and that will be a marked contrast to what happens in New York in the early 20th century. So I had to set that up. Next random thing I want to talk about, I'm surprised no one's asked about it before because it's often asked about, and that is the influence of the Romani or Roma or Rom. There's a lot of different names for these people. The old name for them was the Gypsies, but we're really trying to shy away from that term. So I'm going to say Gypsy one more time, and that's the last time I'm saying it in this class. The Romani. People have rightly noticed a lot of similarities between the Romani music and Jewish klezmer music. Well, yeah, there is a lot of similarity. There's a lot of overlap because we know from many written and oral accounts that it was not that unusual for Jewish and Romani musicians to work side by side. Let me elaborate. The Jews and the Romanis had a lot in common in the old country. I mean, they were both kind of independent ethnic groups, independent societies that were excluded from the larger society the society at large, the surrounding civilization, if you will. Now, they went about that exclusion, they handled that exclusion differently. The Jews had their own separate villages, shtetl. So you'd have, Christian village, Jewish village. Christian village, Jewish village. And the Romani, of course, were famously nomadic. But they were both existing in this geographic area, but were somehow excluded from it. And we know that it was not that uncommon that if either one of those groups needed to augment their band for a particular occasion, they would borrow from each other. So if a Jewish capella decided they needed to beef up their ensemble for some reason, they would borrow from the local Romani band, and vice versa. So you have a significant number of Jewish and Romani musicians working in each other's band, learning each other's repertoire. So indeed, yes, there's a lot of Romani influence on Jewish klezmer music and vice versa. The Romani are also significant because they're, as I like to sometimes glibly describe, the earliest form of radio. Meaning the Romani are learning some of these regional dance forms, some of these regional song forms, and spreading them, albeit very slowly, spreading them around the rest of Eastern Europe in their travels. It's only because of the Romani that someone in the Ukraine might hear a Hungarian Shardash, or someone, in Bulgaria might hear a Ukrainian Kolomaiki, because the Romani are learning some of these regional dance forms, incorporating them into their repertoire, and spreading them gradually throughout the rest of Eastern Europe. One more quick thing I want to talk about that I haven't mentioned yet. That's this thing. The clarinet. How did this instrument that is neither Jewish nor Eastern European come to be so closely associated with this music? Let me give some background. We know from both, written and oral accounts and depictions in art and descriptions in literature from a whole variety of sources, we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that for hundreds of years, this was a string-dominated music. The primary melodic voice of this music were ancestors or cousins of the modern-day violin, what musicologists tend to call the viol family. A soprano viol is like a violin, a alto viol is like a viola, tenor viol like a cello, bass viol is like a double bass. And some of these capellas might have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different viols of different sizes. Clarinet nowhere to be heard. But all of a sudden, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, in the old country, the clarinet is quickly introduced in this music and quickly supplants the violin as the dominant voice in klezmer. Now, why does that happen? All right, let me give you a little history of the clarinet first in general. The clarinet is a relatively young instrument as far as Western orchestral instruments are concerned. The clarinet really evolves over several decades, largely in France, in the mid-18th century, 1700s. Bach, Haydn, Handel, all those other Baroque composers, they never wrote a single note for clarinet. Not because they didn't like it, but because it didn't even exist. I mean, really, one of the very first notable compositions to speak of for clarinet is Mozart's famous clarinet concerto, which he wrote in his final year of his life, right before the Requiem. Let's see if I remember any of it. I think somewhere right now in an unmarked grave in Austria, something just rolled over. And anyway, the clarinet isn't even really a standard part of the orchestra until the 19th century. Beethoven's really one of the first significant composers to make the clarinet a regular part of his orchestral compositions. Well, the clarinet will have become very popular in the mid-19th century. In fact, in the mid-19th century in France, there's really kind of a clarinet craze of sorts. Everyone has a clarinet. There are entire bands of nothing but clarinets. It becomes a very popular instrument. Not surprisingly, it's a great instrument. And it's said that perhaps that many of Napoleon's foot soldiers played clarinet, and he had bands of nothing but clarinets in his band. And it's said that many of those French soldiers may have dropped their clarinets on Russian soil as they were fleeing back to France after Napoleon's failed invasion. For whatever reason, by the end of the 19th century, the clarinet has made its way into Eastern Europe and is very quickly adopted by these klezmer musicians as a primary voice of this music, not joining the violin, but replacing it, supplanting it as the primary voice of this. Why? Why are Jewish musicians so quick to cotton to this foreign instrument and give it such a place of prominence in the music? Let me split that question in half. First half of the question. What does the clarinet have in common with the violin that lends itself to this music? Well, several things. It's portable. It's easy to play while moving around. These bands have to play outdoors. You have to be mobile. You can easily play the clarinet and the violin while moving. Lord knows I can't even stand still when I'm playing the clarinet. That's one big thing. Another big thing is that the clarinet and the violin are really the two instruments best suited to mimic the human voice. You know, we associate with klezmer a lot of these cantorial type reflections, the grace notes and trills, the cracked or crying, the laughing, the schmear. I'll get to that later. Anyway, you can do those kind of sounds on a violin. You can also do those kind of sounds on a clarinet. You can't do those kind of sounds very well on a lot of other instruments. You can't make those kind of sounds on a trumpet or an oboe or, God forbid, a bassoon or something like that. So those are the commonalities of the clarinet and the violin. But what is the one clear advantage the clarinet has over the violin? And it's the single reason why it replaces the violin as the primary instrument of this music. Now, if we were in person, I could give you a demonstration that would make this painfully obvious to you. The one clear advantage the clarinet has over it, yes, it is louder. It is a lot louder. It is exponentially louder. Look, you go hear an orchestra, a single clarinet in the back row can be heard over 40 violins strumming away. It is much louder than the violin. Now, we tend not to think that much about the relative volume of instruments these days because we live in the age of cheap and plentiful amplification. Nothing really matters in terms of volume. Everything can be turned up or equalized or mixed. Most of the music we listen to is recorded, where all volumes are equalized. I mean, look, you turn on your favorite classical radio station, ETA, WETA down there in DC, and they'll play a Haydn string quartet followed by a Mahler symphony, and they're the same volume. Are they even remotely the same volume? No. But they have to kind of equalize them for radio. If they didn't, people would have accidents left and right when they put on the Mahler symphony. So we tend not to think about it. But before modern amplification, the relative volume of instruments is a huge factor of instrumentation. Now, these capellas had to play often outdoors for hundreds of people. You know, the sound just dissipates outdoors with no amplification at all. The fact that the clarinet can do everything a violin can do, but at a much louder volume, is a huge advantage. And that's why in a remarkably short amount of time, at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the clarinet doesn't join the violin as the primary instrument, it replaces it. And by the time we get to New York in the early 20th century, there is no question the clarinet is the dominant instrument in this music, and the violin is relegated to a much more secondary role. And it's really only in the modern klezmer revival, the last few decades, that the clarinet and violin are roughly equal partners. You know, these days it's not uncommon to see a klezmer band have both a clarinet and a violin, trading parts, musically sparring with each other. That never happened. The clarinet and violin were never equals in this music. For hundreds of years, it's the violin, no clarinet. Then all of a sudden, the clarinet replaces the violin. But now with amplification, they can be equal. A lot of times, when I play with a violinist, depending on the room, I'll play acoustically, but the violinist will play through an amplifier to allow them a little more volume so they can compete with me. But hopefully, if I do it right, I'll still be a little bit louder. You know, to this day, clarinetists and violinists have these fierce arguments over which instrument is more central to klezmer music, the violin or the clarinet. You guys all look very intelligent and well-educated, so you all know it's the clarinet. Okay, we're getting to the question and answer period. A few more final things. Just to tease where we're going to be next week. In the year 1881, Tsar Alexander II is assassinated in Russia. And things that had been pretty darn crummy for the Jews go from pretty darn crummy to a whole lot worse. And you guys know the story. I don't need to go into it. The pogroms, the persecution, the drafting into the Tsar's armies, the economic deprivation, you know. As a result of this, between the years 1880 and 1924, over 2.5 million Jews travel across the Atlantic Ocean to settle in the New World, primarily in New York, because New York is the center of the known universe. What happens to that music in the journey across the Atlantic Ocean? Well, to find out, you got to come back exactly 1 week from tonight. Same seats, class. Now, before we turn things over to Mindy to wrestle some questions for me, first of all, let me encourage you. Any questions or comments, go ahead, type them in the chat right now, and in a few minutes, Mindy will relay them to me. I also want to do the shameless plug. You know, look for me around. You can find me online. I've got an unusual name. You type me into YouTube, into Spotify, into Amazon, whatever. You'll find my albums. You'll find my video stuff. Anyone in the DC area, I do want to briefly mention, I'm starting to return to live performing, and I've actually got a concert this Sunday. One of my first concerts back. It's part of the Living Arts concert series in Burtonsville, Maryland, in Montgomery County. There I am. There may not be a beard at the performance, so that's deceptive advertising there. It's a free concert. It's actually in a church of all places. They host it, the Church of the Resurrection. But yes, I'm playing Klezmer in Church of the Resurrection. But if anyone's in the area wants to come to it, that would be great. They're also going to try to live stream it on YouTube. Not sure if they will. If you're interested in that, go to livingartsconcerts.com. I'll put that in the chat window. And what I'm going to do right now is play a very short another tune for you while people finish furiously typing their questions. So let's see. I'm going to do something slower. Let's see. Here's another old traditional tune. This is called Fern de Mechutonim Achem, or the escorting of the parents of the bride and bridegroom. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, having done that, I'm going to co-spotlight Mindy here as soon as I find her. There she is. I'm going to co-spotlight you, and you can go ahead and relay.
All right, very good. Well, we've got a very interesting array of questions. There are some folks here who really know this world, who even have family connections. But before we go into the current period, or even a little bit before that, I want to go way back further and ask you a bit more about the world in which the klezmer lived. Okay, I'm not asking you to be a musicologist and take us back through all the twists and turns of Jewish musical history, Seth, but if you could say a little bit more about the musical world in the Jewish context that the klezmer found themselves in. What was there before? We're talking about the 17th, well, the 18th century maybe. What was there in the 17th and the 16th and the 15th in the Ashkenazi world?
You know, that's interesting you mentioned that. I talk about that in some of my longer programs, and I kind of call that period the quote-unquote prehistory of klezmer. Because the truth is, until someone invents a time machine, we'll never really know the specifics. Now look, there are vibrant Jewish communities in Eastern Europe dating back to about, I believe, 1100, 1200 AD. Obviously, they had music, but none of the music was obviously recorded. There was no phonograph, no radio. I don't even think they had smartphones. They were still using flip phones. And perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned this music was in the old country strictly an oral, A-U-R-A-L tradition, not notated with any type of notation, traditional Western notation or any other form. So with none of it notated and none of it recorded, how do we know what this music sounded like 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago? Well, the short answer is we don't. Now, there are some scholars who have extrapolated a bit by taking some of those earliest wax cylinder recordings. There have been depictions in art, like art carvings that go back hundreds of years that show a Jewish wedding, you know, in the shtetl. And there's the band, there's the kapella in the corner. There's some descriptions in Yiddish literature. There's some circumstantial evidence, and people have made some wonderful educated guesses about what this music may have sounded like hundreds of years ago. But they are just that. Educated guesses, and without a time machine, we'll really never know the specifics of what this music sounded like for hundreds of years.
Ron asks, why is there an apparent preference for the minor key in the music?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I don't want to get too technical here, and a lot of people ask this. Now, there's a lot of minor key stuff, but a lot of klezmer that people think is in a minor key actually really isn't. You see, there's a lot of other ways to organize scale sound than major and minor. There are scales that if Bach had heard, he would have keeled over right in his organ bench. And klezmer uses a lot of those. For example, let's just do one quick song that some of you may have passing familiarity with. This song, I'll play just a little bit. Hava Tequila. I'm sorry, Hava Nagila. People say, oh, that's in a minor key, isn't it? Well, no, not really. It actually uses one of those non-Western scales. It uses a scale that Jewish musicians often call Ahava Rabbah, which is Hebrew for boundless love, endless love. The scale goes like this. Now that sounds minor to a lot of people's ears, but it's not. Those scales have their origins in the music of the Middle East. In fact, that same exact scale in Arabic music is called Hijaz. Same scale. They have one name for it, we have another. Which brings me to the point I often like to make. If musicians ran the world, there'd be no wars. Now, nothing would ever get done, but at least there'd be no wars, so that's a net gain.
Okay. Now, questions about the musical instruments. Marcia says that Jews weren't allowed to play the drums. There were some instruments that they were kept from. Do you know anything about that, Seth?
I'm not 100% sure, but my understanding is any restrictions like that, for all practical purposes, were confined to the urban centers, to the cities. That's where the Jews had a lot more restrictions on their activities in terms of jobs and perhaps I don't know about the instruments, but if there were restrictions, it would have been there. In the shtetls, in the little villages, Jews were generally left to their own devices. And to the best of my knowledge, in these shtetls, in these villages, there were no restrictions on instruments. In fact, many of these bands did feature percussion instruments in the form of like a drum set, nothing that looked like this.
Oh my gosh.
Individual percussion instruments, what we might call today marching band style. In fact, in many of these capellas, young boys were often given percussion instruments as their first instrument when they first joined, the family capella. So you might have some kind of frame drum or some kind of bass drum or all sorts of different individual percussion instruments. So if there was any kind of restriction on percussion instruments, which I'm not sure of, it was probably just in the urban areas.
Okay, somebody asked something that would be relevant to a time period closer to ours. He's curious about accordions.
Yes.
I don't even know when accordions were invented. Are they an Italian invention? What are they?
Well, okay, you're not that far off the mark, Mindy. Now, in Eastern Europe, they did have accordion-like instruments or instruments in the accordion family, but they were smaller type of button accordions. What you might call today a concertina or a squeeze box. That's what they had, those kind of smaller button accordions. Now, the big piano accordion that has an actual keyboard at the side, the stomach Steinway, as I like to call it, that indeed was an Italian invention, as you pointed out, Mindy, and they did not have that in the old country throughout most of this time period. Now, when these musicians get to New York, they do have those type of piano accordions, and they actually become quite popular in this music. So you will start to see those big accordions pop up in klezmer music fairly frequently in New York. But in the old country, the only accordions you tended to see were those smaller kind of concertina or squeeze box type of accordions.
Let me ask you my own question.
Sure.
About the heritage of the klezmer in terms of the musicians themselves. Would it be the father who learned this from listening to his father? How far back are we going? And would it be all the boys or the boys who showed some proclivity to learning to play an instrument who joined the band? How did this go?
My understanding is it was largely all the boys. If that was the family trade, that was the family trade. And there are musical families that can trace back their lineage, quite a few generations, including some people like Naftuli Brandwein and Dave Terrace, who we're going to talk about in next week's session. Now, look, as you start to get up into the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there start to be more and more exceptions to this. More Jews, young Jews, are attracted to the urban centers, to the cities, and then, of course, eventually to America. And one of the things we're going to talk about next week is that in New York, the family structure of these bands disintegrates almost completely. And all those old rules pretty much go out the window in the very different environment of the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Okay, people are asking some questions about what you're going to talk about next week, but maybe we can do a little bit of this week. They're interested to know how people in this country learned to play klezmer music, that there was a camp in upstate New York.
This camp.
Okay, so talk about that. And then they're interested in particular individuals. John Zorn. And somebody is a relative of Abraham Most. Do I have the name right?
Most?
Most, yeah. So
okay.
about these individuals and the training for the New World klezmer?
Sorry, no particular order. Yeah, Abe Most, if there's kin of his, he was fantastic, wonderful clarinet saxophonist, played jazz, played Jewish music. Also, I think wrote a few books, like in musical instruction books. I think I have an Abe Most book lying around somewhere in this mess of a basement. So yes, he was a wonderful, wonderful musician and lived a really long time. I think he only passed away a few years ago. I want to say he lived to like 100 something. If there's kin of his in here, perhaps they can clarify that for me. Let's see, John Zorn. Oh my goodness, John Zorn, great saxophonist, composer, led the band Masada throughout the 1990s in New York. Now, I am a big fan of John Zorn, have seen him live, a dozen or so times. I doubt I'll really get to him because, to be honest, John Zorn is the first to tell you that his music is not klezmer. And he's even occasionally, recoiled against that pretty harshly. People say, avant-garde klezmer, new klezmer. He's like, no, this music is not klezmer. It's new music. It's jazz. It's whatever. And it's influenced by klezmer. There's no question klezmer has influenced John Zorn. But he's taken that influence and incorporated it into his own very unique avant-garde musical category, which I love. Maybe I can squeeze in a week. We'll see. As far as Klez Camp doesn't exist anymore, but I don't want to be a grouchy old guy, but kids today learning this music have it so much easier than an old alto cocker like me, because I started learning this music in ancient history in the 1990s, in the last millennium, and even when I started to learn the music, there was very limited resources to go to. There were some old records I was able to get my hands on. There had been 1 or 2 CDs put out of reissued recordings and some early klezmer revival recordings. There had been 1 book of sheet music transcription, published. I had minimal information to begin my klezmer studies with. But young musicians starting today, and there are a lot of them, there is just a treasure trove of recordings, of transcriptions, of essays, of books. There are so many resources now for them to go to. And indeed, although Klez Camp is no longer with us, there's Yiddish New York every December. There's Klez Canada. There's the Ashkenaz Festival in Canada, happens every other year. There are all these festivals. The infrastructure of the klezmer revival has really blossomed over the last several decades. So young musicians who want to learn this music today have no shortage of resources, both virtual resources and in-person resources to draw upon.
Okay, let me go back a ways again to the early origins and influences on klezmer. In terms of the folk music of the people in the Christian villages, Bela Bartok was roaming around, he was recording. They were in their separate villages, but they interacted at some level. And how did the musical influences flow or not flow between these worlds?
There is a tremendous cross-fertilization and a lot of influence on Jewish klezmer from non-Jewish Eastern European dance forms. I mean, sometimes when people ask me to describe kind of the musical ingredients of klezmer, a gross oversimplification, that's not completely inaccurate, is to say if you take Middle Eastern, Arabic scales and modes, and superimpose them over non-Jewish Eastern European rhythms, like your basic polka beat, you get klezmer. Now, that's a slight oversimplification, but there's a real, more than a few grains of truth in that. You take these Middle Eastern sounds and superimpose them over Eastern European dance forms, like the polka, like the mazurka, like the kolomaiki, all this stuff, and you pretty much end up with klezmer. Look, not to get too far ahead of myself and not to open up a whole nother box of worms, but one of the reasons why klezmer was generally frowned upon in the early decades of the Zionist movement, and indeed in the state of Israel in early decades, was because it was seen as having too many non-Jewish elements. As you know, the Jewish people were supposed to, the Zionist cultural philosophy was the Jewish people should foster culture that was purely Jewish. And klezmer and Yiddish and all that went with it was seen as having too many non-Jewish ingredients. Now, that's not true today. I mean, klezmer is very well accepted in Israel. And in fact, there's quite a robust klezmer scene in Israel today. So what I just described to you is not an accurate description of 2021.
Okay. We don't have too much more time, but this is a good way to kind of segue to talking about next week a bit more. Eileen wants to know, what led you, Seth, to klezmer?
Okay. Well, when I was 13, for my brat mitzvah in the suburbs of New York, my parents hired a klezmer accordionist to play. This guy by the name of Cy Kushner. He comes from a long line of klezmerim. His son has the family band today. So you're probably thinking, oh, that explains it. This is where 13-year-old Seth first heard this music and fell in love, right? No, I hated it. I wanted to have nothing to do with it. I spent most of my bar mitzvah in the back parking lot with my friends, lighting the little restaurant matchbooks to make little bonfires. I wasn't interested in this music. I didn't hear it growing up. So fast forward now to my sophomore year at college. I went to Cornell up in Ithaca, New York, and I searched through the course catalog and found the two most useless majors I could find, music and American studies. And my sophomore year, I was starting to get a little bored with my classes, looking for an activity. And I passed a sign on a bulletin board that said, make your booby and Zadie proud, make your grandmother and grandfather proud, join a klezmer band. And I was intrigued. Now, I knew nothing about klezmer, but I must have heard the word in passing somewhere because I knew it was a type of Jewish music. That was the extent of my knowledge. So I went into the Cornell Music Library and spent a couple of hours roaming around in the stacks. And they had a pretty extensive library. And I found a handful of records, some 78s and 45s that were 50, 60, 70 years old, as well as some early recordings of the still nascent klezmer revival. And I sat down at a listening carousel, one of the record stations, and started listening. And I just fell in love. And one of the things that attracted me to the music was the energy, the excitement, the freshness of what I was hearing, even though a lot of what I was hearing was over half a century old. So I answering the ad and became a founding member of a band known as Cayuga, Klezmer Revival.
Oh my
God. Lake Cayuga up there.
Oh,
and, that was a good 25, almost 30 years ago. So I've made myself a real serious student of the music ever since then.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. In about 2 minutes, give us a little bit more of a prelude to next week.
Okay. We're going to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to talk about how things changed in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And in particular, we're going to talk about how it became fiercely competitive among musicians in the Lower East Side, which gives rise to the phenomenon of the klezmer virtuoso, a few incredibly talented musicians who became basically celebrities within the Jewish immigrant community. And we're going to talk about some of these wonderful musicians, two clarinetists in particular. Naftuli Brandwein, one of the most flamboyant musical figures you'll ever encounter, and Dave Taras, maybe a few others as time allows. I will probably also tell you a little more about Bimirbis Duchesne, since that comes up almost in every presentation.
What about the ladies? Are there women now in klezmer bands?
Yes. Okay, so one of the anachronisms of the klezmer revival is from the very beginning, women played a very important role. And I would say, if you sit down and do the math, it's pretty close to gender equity in the world of klezmer today, which is pretty impressive because the world of jazz hasn't done that yet, much to its jazz is still has a long way to go in that department. But from the very beginning of the revival, women have played a very important role, and there are quite a few incredibly talented women playing this music. So these anachronisms are a good thing.
Well, in jazz, you have vocalists who are women, but not necessarily. Yeah. Not
to get too into it, jazz is moving in the right direction. There is a higher percentage of female instrumentalists than ever before, but it's still nowhere near 50%.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. We'll end with this little bit of information from Sandy. She's saying that her cousin Shyla Fink, along with her husband Kinsey Posen, are in a klezmer group from Winnipeg
Called Finjon.
Finjon.
I know them. I jammed with them many, many years ago, probably 1998, 99, at a klezmer festival in Toronto, the Ashkenaz festival. And I became buddies with the clarinetist with that group, and I'm blanking on his name. I can picture him. A tall, lanky guy who looks vaguely like David Bowie. That was the clarinetist, and I can't remember his name, but he was a really nice guy, and we became buddies.
Well, maybe Sandy can, Myron
Schultz. Yeah, that could be it. That sounds right. I think that's it.
Look, you've gotten rave reviews here, and I don't need to go through them, but people have had a wonderful time with you, Seth, and they're going to come back for more. And now I think we'll go to Jerry. And any last words from you, Seth, before we move on?
Just come back next week and, tell all your friends, tell all your enemies. We've got plenty of room here in the Zoom meeting.
Bueno. Okay, Jerry?
Again, I want to thank Seth for another great performance, both in terms of teaching us things and playing things sometimes just on the spur of the moment. I want to thank, of course, Mindy for her great questions, and also for Victoria and Bracha for helping to monitor the screens and stuff. As I put into the chat, by me and Mr. Shern, one of the guests of my parents' hotel, my parents owned a hotel in the Catskills, claimed that he wrote that song. And I just looked it up, and there's about 4 or 5 people who all claim they wrote that song. He was one of them. And you talk about Romania, and Aaron Lebedoff with Once or Twice a Summer being our hotel. Romania. I remember that very well. And if you ever go to the Catskill recording on our website, it's by Phil Brown, who's the world expert in Catskills. And he also plays in a klezmer band called Two Klez for Comfort. So klezmer seems to be universal. And we'll learn a lot more about klezmer next week. And I thank you again, Seth, for a wonderful performance. And thank you for all you people who have joined us. And I hope you all come back next week.
And Seth, you have unbelievable energy. It seems to never end.